Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. A warm welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us in this webinar, COP16, focusing on strengthening civil society engagement across climate and biodiversity conventions. We are, as always, very grateful to you all for having taken the time to join us, and I know we are going to be joined by folks speaking different languages. I hope that you have been able to see the instructions for your interpretation for Spanish and Portuguese and French, I believe, as well. And I'm going to ask, there we go. I was going to ask the technical team to share the instructions in the chat. So please go to the chat if you're not familiar with using the interpretation function, and you should be able to get instructions so you can listen to the webinar, listen to the different speakers in a language of your choice. As always, we are going to try to speak as slowly and as clearly as possible while keeping an eye on the time, just so that everybody is able to participate and enjoy the discussions that we're having. As a very quick introduction, because my job is actually very short and sweet here. My name is Josh Ogada, and I'm a director at South North. And it is my pleasure to be here with two programs that do sit in our program portfolio, the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, as well as the Voices for Just Climate Action, who have other organizational partners. I see my brother Eduardo Rotela from Avina, Fundación Avina here as well. So we will be jointly presenting this discussion. Just to give those of you who may not be familiar with South North a very, very brief introduction and why this is important for us. We are a Global South-based nonprofit organization that seeks to tackle three major global crises, being climate change, inequality, and biodiversity loss, as well as ecosystem degradation. And we do this by supporting national and regional interventions, partnerships, and deep collaboration. So by doing this, we connect people and information, we enhance capabilities, and we mobilize resources as well to respond in ways that are innovative to the challenges and opportunities that climate change presents us. So for us, this particular discussion around one of the three important Rio conventions is hugely important as we come up on CBD COP16 this coming October. The focus on connecting civil society and having them engage in the global environmental governance space becomes all the more crucial. And this includes engagement not just across the UNFCCC, which for us definitely as SSN, but I know a lot of the other organizations tend to focus a lot on, being that we primarily work in climate change. It is hugely important to connect with the other Rio conventions, and this particular case, the CBD. So we do this, and we are very keen as organizations to make sure that civil society's contributions to the CBD and other Rio conventions are enhanced and broadened so that we cover a much broader area with the environmental agenda. We know that climate change as well as biodiversity loss are inextricably linked, and we want to make sure that the participation of civil society is equal and that civil society themselves are connecting and mutually strengthening one another in terms of engagement in this massively important global environmental governance space. So we are inviting you to engage with us today. We have got an excellent panel of speakers who are going to be talking to us in terms of what to expect from COP16 of the CBD. And we hope that in our midst, we have experts, activists, policymakers, who will be able to share their strategies, their best practices, and also case studies that focus on specifically on amplifying the voices of civil society, amplifying the voices of a capacitated civil society in this space. So with those few words, I would like to hand over to our moderator for the day and wish you all a wonderful discussion going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josh. So hello, everybody. My name is Nadia Sitas, and I'm the Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Thematic Lead for CDKN, one of the partners in this webinar. So just some basic housekeeping before we start. I think Josh has spoken about interpretation that's available. We also will be posting some instructions in the chat just to make sure that everyone can participate and engage as much as possible. Please tag yourself and change your name with your organization. Feel free to use the chat and the Q&A function. If you have a question that pops into mind, please pop it in the Q&A box. In any language that you'd like to, but preferably one of the languages that we have interpretation for. Please also, if you see a question in the chat that you'd like to answer yourself, please feel free to do so. If you, we've got interpretation available, and also if you are struggling with and need some extra technical support, then please do send us a message and or just mention that in the chat and we can try and assist you as well. So moving on to the next slide, please. So this session was brought together through a range of conversations that we've been having across different projects and with different partners, and really is to provide just a quick snapshot to enhance and find ways to enhance civil society engagement in climate and biodiversity conventions. It also, through one of the speakers, will provide an overview of COP16 and some of the issues and opportunities that will be there. We also hope to explore some strategies for effective engagement in those processes to facilitate some knowledge sharing and collaboration amongst different organizations that are present here today, and to promote some ideas of the synergies between climate and biodiversity actions. So we'd really like to, through this very, very short conversation, is to identify opportunities to influence policy and practice outcomes at the CBD COP and beyond. And just to, I think you may have noticed that we're also recording in all the languages that are offered, and we will be posting this, so this recording is available for everyone that maybe wasn't able to join us live today. So next slide, please. This is the agenda. You can see we've already gone past some of those agenda points. And so maybe just to let you all know what will happen for the remainder of the hour. We'll have Tristan Tyrrell from the CBD Secretariat, who will provide just some background on the UN CBD and also what's in store for many people in the discussions at COP16. We'll have a moment for question and answers, and then move on to our panel discussion with our speakers. So just to also mention again that please do post as much as you can in the chat. We're trying to, it's really hard in a webinar to make it engaging, but we're hoping that we can stimulate an initial discussion here that can be carried into all of the spaces where you work. So moving on. Next slide, please. We've got a range of diverse speakers today that are speaking from lots of different knowledge and practice and policy community spaces. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to please introduce yourself in a bit more detail when you start speaking for the first time. But there'll also be an opportunity for you to direct specific questions. If you have a question for somebody, please do direct that question to that person. So maybe moving swiftly on, I'd like to just welcome Tristan to share some insights and some background for those that are new to the CBD process, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity. Tristan, if I can hand over the floor to you to provide some of those details. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm muted, sorry about that. Thank you, Nadia. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today. I have a few slides, so I will just quickly share those. Now, hopefully you can see that okay. Yes, so my name is Tristan Tyrrell. I am the Program Management Officer for Biodiversity and Climate Change and Dry and Subhumid Lands at the CBD Secretariat. So my job is on a technical level to look at the synergies between the three Rio conventions, ourselves, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. But today we're going to be focusing very much on the biodiversity climate nexus and the work that's being undertaken under the CBD in that regard, and then looking forward to COP16 and where we're going with a number of topics, but also including the biodiversity and climate change nexus. So for those who are, here we go. For those who are unaware, the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, is one of the 3 Rio conventions that came out of the Rio conference in 1992. So it's a sister convention to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. The convention itself has 3 main objectives: the conservation of biological diversity, as would be expected, the sustainable use of components of biodiversity, so looking at how we are engaging with nature and the benefits that we derive from it, and then specifically, because the definition of biodiversity also includes genetic diversity, so it's from the genetic level right up to the ecosystem level, going through species, it's also looking at that genetic diversity as well, and ensuring that how we are deriving benefits from nature, including at the genetic level, is done in a fair and equitable manner. Under the convention, there are also 2 protocols that have been developed subsequently. One on biosafety, again relating to genetic material and living modified organisms, and the Nagoya Protocol specifically on the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of genetic resources. These are linked, but also slightly separate to the main convention. But the discussions in Cali in Colombia in October next month will also be relevant to them. Under the convention, there are a number of thematic programs and then a large number of cross-cutting issues. So thematic programs largely focus on particular ecosystem types, particular biomes, or specific considerations such as agricultural biodiversity, given the strong link. The cross-cutting issues is much broader, but it includes things that are not necessarily ecosystem or biome specific, but more on approaches on how we are addressing biodiversity loss and ensuring that we are putting ourselves on the right track to respecting nature and living in harmony with it. So there are certain things within that are under that list that are relevant, I think, to some of this discussion. There's issues around capacity building. There's issues around climate change and biodiversity, and that link, given that climate change is both a threat to biodiversity as well as the role of nature of biodiversity in helping us address climate change. Other approaches such as protected areas, invasive alien species, things like that. But then there's also engagement with particular stakeholders. So there's issues around gender, issues around how the role and respecting the rights of indigenous peoples, of local communities, and a number of other things. One that I also want to flag is the ecosystem approach, which is about looking at things on a more holistic level, recognizing that we are part of the ecosystem, but ecosystems don't stop because of particular boundaries. There are links. It's a complex system, and we need to be looking at our engagement with biodiversity, with nature, on that holistic level. Specifically on biodiversity and climate change, I'm sorry that these slides are quite wordy, and I'm asking the organizers to share these slides with you so that you can look into these in a bit more detail if you wish. But this is just to highlight that there has been consideration of biodiversity and climate change going back for about 20 years now at this point under the convention. Initially, it started looking at climate change as the threat that it is to biodiversity, but then over time that has evolved into also looking at what's the role that biodiversity plays in helping us to mitigate and to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Over the course of history within the convention, that particular focus has shifted. Before, it was more on mitigation, especially at the time when REDD and REDD+ was particularly prevalent. Since that time, it has shifted more towards adaptation issues and disaster risk reduction. So with the mitigation discussion being more under UNFCCC, and that is because certain parties would prefer to see that as being the differentiation between the two conventions on this topic. I think that continues to evolve, and especially now with the global goal on adaptation under the UNFCCC, that line in the sand as such is shifting, but you'll see there that for instance, in 2018, the voluntary guidelines that were adopted on ecosystem-based adaptation and ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction highlight that emphasis. It's also reflected in this, although I'm not sure to what extent you can see that because the images are slightly fuzzy, but these are all technical documents that were produced by the Secretariat in order to, or at least published by the Secretariat, in order to support parties that are, as in member states, countries that are signed up to the convention and others, to look at this biodiversity climate change nexus. And you'll see earlier on, they were more focused on, well, to a certain extent, more focused on mitigation issues, and more subsequently, it's been on adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And this is also just to highlight that there has been a lot of technical work that has been done, either published directly by ourselves, but also by a wide range of partners, specifically to try and support the implementation of those decisions that have been taken at the various conferences of the parties down through the, or the meetings of the conference of the parties down through the years. But this also is an ongoing process, especially as knowledge is developed, as capacity is developed, but also as that complexity that I mentioned is being taken on board, and people are trying to work through that, that there is the support available to governments, but also to non-state actors, so that everyone plays that important role in helping us address these interconnected crises that we're facing of biodiversity loss and climate change. At the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, COP15, which was in December 2022, the current strategic plan as such for the convention was adopted. This is the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and it itself is an update of the previous one, which was which had the Aichi biodiversity targets up until 2020, which itself built on the 2010 biodiversity target. So this is the third round of global goals and targets, focusing on trying to address the negative trends of biodiversity loss and degradation that we're facing. So the overarching mission is to by 2030 to have halted and start reversing that negative trend. And then by 2050, the overall vision is to put us on a track to living in harmony with nature, and that's the slogan as such, is living in harmony with nature. The framework itself is structured under 4 goals. These 4 goals link with the 3 objectives of the convention and of conserving sustainable use and genetic resources, and the benefits arising from it. But the 4th one then is specifically around means of implementation. What is needed to support parties and others in order to achieve the framework? And so that's capacity building, it's resource mobilization, the funding, the financing also needs to be there as well. What's the role of the private sector in all of this? And of course, what's the role of various stakeholder groups, including Indigenous peoples and local communities? Under the 4 goals, then there are 23 action-orientated targets, and these are the ones that I suppose are more prominent. So you might have heard of the 30 by 30 target, which usually refers to the protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. So that side of management. But there are other 30 by 30 targets. There's also a financing one. And there's also restoring 30% by 2030. I'll talk a bit more about some of the targets specifically related to climate change, but these targets look at spatial planning, they look at sustainable use of species, and they look at the role of the private sector about recognizing their risks and dependencies and things like that. There are also some cross-cutting considerations which link in a sense with some of the cross-cutting themes that I mentioned earlier. So there's things about recognizing the role of the ecosystem approach within all of this, the role of gender, intergenerational equity, the role of Indigenous peoples, local communities, and respecting their traditional knowledge and practices. There's also one that has emerged more recently, actually two that have emerged more recently. One is specifically on biodiversity and health, to have that specifically within the framework, and that is largely as a result of the pandemic. But the other one I wanted to highlight was the human rights-based approach and recognizing the right to a safe, clean, and healthy environment, and the need to take that human rights approach in implementing the global biodiversity framework. There are other considerations there, implementation support mechanisms. These are things like the capacity building and financing, monitoring and review, because frankly, if it's not being measured, it's probably not being managed effectively. And then communication, making sure that people are aware and understand the importance of biodiversity and how we are all ultimately dependent on it. Just some of the targets. The targets themselves, a bit like the SDGs, are supposed to be indivisible, but specifically related to climate change, there's target 8, which is about the threat of climate change and recognizing that even climate change actions themselves can have a negative impact on biodiversity. So, for instance, the development of wind or solar energy installations or even hydroelectric, but also thinking about what are the positive impacts from taking action on climate change for biodiversity, but also on how biodiversity can support those actions on climate change. Target 11 is specifically around the benefits in the broader sense about what we get from nature and the ultimate positive impacts from good conservation, restoration, and protection of nature. And included in that specifically is also recognition of its role within adaptation and mitigation for climate change. And then there's some of the others looking at urban areas, looking at the role of spatial planning, decision-making at every level, because one of the other considerations that I should have mentioned as well is that there's a need to take a whole of society and whole of government approach. And so that transparency and participation at all levels, at all scales, is important. And then issues relating to knowledge sharing, capacity building, and recognizing also the different worldviews and knowledge systems that exist. These are some of those cross-cutting considerations that I mentioned earlier. So I won't go back through these again, but it's mentioned there, human rights-based approach, the whole of government, whole of society approach, and of course, cooperation and synergies is another one. And so working with the climate community as well as others to make sure that we're working synergistically and effectively together towards a common goal. So COP16 next month in Cali, Colombia. So this will be the first time the parties will formally meet in a decision-making process since COP15, since the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So it'll be a chance to evaluate progress in terms of national target setting, the policy documents that they are supposed to revise related to that, which are National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, or NBSAPs, but also to consider where is the financing, what's the status in terms of financing, and the status in terms of that monitoring framework. As I mentioned, if it's not measured, it's probably not managed or not effectively managed. And so there will be a number of discussions and deliberations around all of those issues. The final one is that there's a multilateral mechanism on the fair and equitable sharing of genetic resources. digital sequence information on genetic resources specifically. And there has been good progress in terms of the pre-negotiations on that. So that process is also expected to be finalized, which will also have a financial mechanism attached to it. However, those are just the headline issues. These are the actual substantive agenda items that will be discussed. Again, apologies that it is such a wordy text, wordy slide, but I wanted to just emphasize with this that there are quite a number of agenda items, substantive agenda items to be considered at COP16, including the hopefully the adoption of a global action plan on biodiversity and health, further consideration on things like invasive alien species, implementation of Article 8J and related provisions. That is specifically that engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities, and there have been a number of issues under concern there. Resource mobilization and the financial mechanism, again, because money, frankly, is what makes the world go round. And then biodiversity and climate change. The biodiversity and climate change agenda item itself, there are, frankly, biodiversity and climate change under the CBD is not a very straightforward negotiation. Again, relating to that issue of mandates between the various conventions. And so, for instance, at COP15, there was no biodiversity and climate decision taken because things came to a stalemate. And so there was the hope that to get things back on track now at COP16. There is a draft decision that is quite long, but there is a lot to cover. And so we are expecting quite a number of late nights related to that. But most of the issues under consideration under the biodiversity and climate decision are related to how do CBD implementers, whether it's government or others, engage with their UNFCCC counterparts and others. A potential request, or there is a request in draft for further technical guidance, again coming back to mitigation related issues. So we'll see if that goes through, and then various capacity building issues. There's been quite a bit of progress, I think, on that nexus of biodiversity and climate change under other fora. So that'll hopefully be a good sign to see this this decision progressing at COP16, but we'll have to wait and see. But ultimately, it's about being able to provide the support to parties, to the governments, and to others, to ensure that we are all implementing that Target 8, Target 11, as well as the whole of the GBF effectively, so that we can achieve those targets by 2030. In terms of the structure of the COP itself, so there is a green zone and a blue zone. The blue zone is the sort of more formal, shall we say, UN element, United Nations element of the COP. So in order to gain access to the blue zone, people need to be registered. And the deadline for that is coming up. It's the 15th of September. But within the blue zone, there are the formal negotiations, and there are a number of events, including side events, which are discussion events that usually happen in the lunch breaks and the dinner breaks during the day, unlike under UNFCCC, where side events happen in parallel throughout the day. Under CBD, they're only in the lunch and evening breaks. But then there are also pavilions, and there are various summits and forums that will be in parallel to the negotiations. So there are a number of pavilions, including a specific GBF pavilion. There will be a Colombia pavilion. The Place Quebec one there, I hope you can see that in the sort of whatever color that is, sort of pinky purplish. That is the action zone. So that's about engaging with other non-state actors as such. And that will run for pretty much the entire duration of the COP, but that will be within the blue zone, so it needs to be registered in order to gain access to that. There is also the green zone, which is being organized specifically by the Colombian presidency, the presidency of the COP, so the Colombian government. This will be in a different area further in towards central Cali. Apparently it's about half an hour by the shuttle bus between the blue zone and the green zone. Unfortunately not particularly convenient, but that's just the way it is. And this is open to all, so people can just walk in off the streets and participate in these events. Apparently there are more than 1,000 events being organized over the course of the 2 weeks or so that the green zone will be active. This is just a screenshot from their website. That's the link at the bottom. For some reason it isn't translated into English, it is into French. Anyway, you can have a look there, but it will cover a number of different issues, including biodiversity and climate change. The headline slogan for the COP itself is "Peace with Nature." And so it's about that our link with nature and the importance of it as part of our just social fabric. And so there are a number of discussions in and around that, including a specific day related to that. I've just put up a couple of links here for those who do want to look at these slides a bit more closely. You can get more access to you can get access to more information through these links. But I'm also happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tristan, for sharing all of that. And just to remind folks that there are opportunities to ask some questions in the chat. I think we're not going to go into a Q&A session immediately now. We'll have those questions coming into the chat. You've already answered some of them. You've provided some of those substantive items that may be discussed at COP. And hopefully people reading through some of those items can see themselves in some of those discussion points. But please feel free to ask some more questions either in the Q&A box or in the chat. And of course, if you are going to COP16 and we'll be having some events, please also share those details in the chat so we can compile all of that together. We had a question on the resources. We will share everything with those that have registered for this webinar. So don't feel like you have to take down notes. We'll also share the recordings from this webinar as well. But thank you so much, Tristan. And Tristan will remain here and also be on the panel to answer some questions through for the duration of this webinar. So maybe moving straight onto the panel, as I mentioned earlier, we have some fantastic speakers, all who will share their experience from many different points and many different knowledge and action communities. So we have Mrinalini, who is the founder and director of Women for Biodiversity. We have Eduardo Rotela, who is from Fundación Avina. And we have Bulimo, who is joining us for Youth for Nature and is co-leading the NUCA project. So how we thought we would run this panel is through a couple of questions that we have. But again, there's an opportunity for everyone to share some questions as well as you hear the panelists speak. And we have about 30 minutes or so for this panel discussion. And so maybe if we could kick off with you, Mrinalini, and maybe just to ask you to share some insights into what specific strategies civil society can employ to engage with and influence some of the outcomes at COP16, and particularly in advancing more ambitious biodiversity targets. So handing straight over to you, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nadia. It's lovely to join it. I just wanted to, I'm not able to open my video.
We will fix that for you right now. There we go. Okay.
Yes, sorry if I'm just joining in a bit late. I'm here in the UK for a meeting that is bringing together experts to look at how to strengthen some of the links that you talked about for the CBD, which is on gender. So I have a very, very brief slide. looking at what are the question asked was, what are the key strategies that we engage with? So I just wanted to kind of share a few that we've done as Win for Biodiversity to engage in the space of the CBD. So if you'll allow me, could I share my screen if that's okay?
Sure, we will change some settings that should be available to you very shortly.
Perfect. Okay, let me see if this is going to work. It's one of those things where no matter how many times you do that, it's still complicated. So I hope everybody can see my screen.
Yes, please go ahead.
Perfect. And please do let me know about my time. So it was so my session out here was just to share some practical examples, and this is not limiting, but just a few things on how do we strengthen civil society engagement across the Climate and Biodiversity Convention. So I'm just going to be focusing more on the CBD. I think there are different strategies, and you will see them also being very similar with all the civil society engagement. And I'm just going to briefly talk about some broad ones, because I think you do need a combination of strategies of how you want to engage, who are your friendly parties, like targeting that, the agenda that you are interested in following. And I just want to focus, one is on the platform, capacity building and collaboration. And those will not be anything new to everybody. So I'm just going to be first asking, I think Tristan, you already shared it maybe, but just a question for people is like, what do you really see? And this is an important aspect for anybody coming to the COP, is that you have to first identify, because as a civil society, we are very diverse. We have different agenda items that we bring in. Is that which part of the puzzle you would want to prioritize to engage in the CBD effectively? Now I cannot see everybody's hands or questions, but I'll see the comments. So these are the pieces which builds up on what we know as the biodiversity plan. There are 23 pieces to the plan, which was adopted at the COP15. And these pieces represent, why I always share this is just to also note that it's not only about, okay, my page is gone here, but it is about that they are relevant and represent the different aspects of biodiversity. So it's not only linked up with conservation, but in particular to, you're talking about traditional knowledge, you're talking about target 23 on gender equality, you're talking about target 1, which represents spatial planning, restoration, and others. So my apologies, my figure here seems to have disappeared, but those are the 23 targets that make up of the KMGBF. So I think one focus that I always start with is building that strategy of where you want to engage and which agenda item is a priority to build a very strategic intervention, because sometimes it's also very challenging to follow everything. With the acknowledgement that this is only one part of the CBD, which is the KMGBF. This is again complemented by whether you want to look at a target or a couple of targets through the lens of monitoring framework or through the resource mobilization. So these are the different aspects that would be really very important. Well, I'm somehow losing all my photos here. So one very important aspect is that once you have seen that, okay, this is what our priority areas are, and say, for example, what we are looking at, and particularly right now, is the links between few targets from restoration, which is target 2, spatial planning 1, area-based 1, 2, 3, linking it up with climate change 8, and then also looking at 15. So, is how you do the mapping, 15, 22, 23, with a compilation of Target 19. So these are the acronyms that you somehow end up using in the CBD. Now, also understanding that there is a process for engagement with the CBD as with any other of the Rio conventions. And those are very key strategic points of interventions where I really encourage everybody to really maximize it. Also because they have been very crucial in ensuring that we have a collective voice on certain agendas. So one of them is the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, which is the IIFB, International Indigenous Forum for Biodiversity. Then for gender, you have the CBD Women's Caucus. I will not read everything here. Then you also have a very, very impactful group within the CBD has been the youth, which is a global youth biodiversity network. And for the civil society, you have the CBD Alliance. Now, also understanding that when you come, there's no limit of who you want to engage and who you don't want to engage. You know, you could be a young a woman or a young youth being a young woman youth, being an Indigenous woman, but also representing an NGO. So you could also still engage with the four caucuses or the major stakeholders groups, regardless to also say that you also have the academics and also the growing presence of the business. But these are the four major stakeholders groups who are a crucial part of the negotiations because they do engage and have a set allocated recognition and a presence in providing inputs to the official deliberations. So you have how these platforms work is very important because they also do a prior information session, maybe like this one. So there's discussion on CBD documents, draft decisions. So say, for example, if you're coming for COP16, it's really very important that you have looked into the intersessional meeting of the SUBSTA, which happened in May, which will have an impact on the CBD, and like also the SBI, which is going to take prior to the CBD COP16. And then these is where the platforms also then comes together to decide on common positions. So in the plenary, usually the chairs or the president of the COP will talk about, okay, these are set. So you have the statements by parties, non-parties, member states, agencies, and as we go on, that's where it is. So you have Indigenous Peoples, Women Caucus, Youth, and the CBD Alliance, and they always have at least about 3 to maximum 5 minutes to deliver an intervention. So it's really very important to engage for the positioning through these platforms. So what they do is delivering statements in plenary and working groups, the contact groups, and also interacting and collaborating with parties and the Secretariat of the CBD. Capacity building. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. My whole photographs are kind of gone from here. So one way of doing capacity building is a process. So it's not like, we all come together and we just pull in through the CBD, but it's a process that takes place over the 2 years, right? So we already start campaigns, and I think you'll be, say, for example, one of a very impactful campaign was a flower campaign that we started together with the Women's Caucus, was to kind of give a flower to the so-called gender champions. So that kind of became a very symbolic gesture, and people started, and parties started wanting to have a flower. So we have been running what's called the flower campaign for gender champions, which has really caught up, and everybody actually looks forward to those flowers. And you can have different kinds of campaigns. You have like I said, plenary statements. That's another very important statement to be very specific within that core points. And how we really engage in the CBD has been very concrete, responding to textual positioning, text changes, because we literally get very little time. And then at the COP16, what you'll also have spaces is also for side events. So you have side events, press conference. And besides this, you also have what we prepare, or the caucuses also prepare major groups and organizations are briefers. There are different kind of briefers, which you can again post up online on the CBD website for the meeting. And an important kind of a newsletter that all the parties and everybody really looks forward for is called the ECO. ECO is a short everyday update on different issues that is brought out by the CBD Alliance. And it's also very much welcomed by so you can contribute to that if you have an agenda where you have not been able to speak and you want to say something. So there's also another space to contribute. This is just another key engagement was for us of strategic important. Sorry, my
Sorry,
last
I'm gonna have to cut you short just so that
that's fine. This is the last one. Sorry. And this one is basically to kind of go forward to preparation for the COP. Please have a look. Win for Biodiversity has compiled all the gender decisions from COP1 to COP15 and is available in 3 languages so far. We have a training module if you want to, and we have editable PowerPoint presentations. So please use it. Lovely to have your inputs. And also we also take out these important ones you all are here is engaging is to prepare previously these policy recommendations. This is just a sample of the last meeting in May. So I'll stop at that and thank you very much. Sorry for the missing pages, but hopefully I'll get the proper one to share with all the participants. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing that and some of those very practical actions that you've done. So thanks for sharing that. And maybe if I can ask you to just pop some of those links in the chat. I'm sure others would love to look at them. We will be compiling everything and we can make sure we take your presentation with all the images there as well. So thank you very much. And one thing that you mentioned was the importance of engaging and the opportunities with the different caucuses that are available. And you mentioned the role of the Youth Caucus. And I wondered, we have someone who has experience of working in that space. And so I wondered if we can invite Peter Bulimo to offer some insights into what the role of grassroots movements are for driving progress towards biodiversity targets. And especially for realizing the decade of ecosystem restoration, and maybe some insights into some of the enabling mechanisms like finance in that space. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nadia, for the opportunity and for the great presentation from the previous speakers. I think I do not have a presentation to make, but I'll just maybe do some quick reflection from the work that I've done for the past 1.5 years working with grassroots movement. I think one thing that came out very clearly was the realization that actually biodiversity action is happening at a very multi-scala level. There is the policy formulation and implementation, there is the lobby and advocacy, but there is also the awareness, capacity building, and innovation that mostly happens at the grassroots level. However, within the course of my duty of tour, I have come to realize that there is a significant disconnect between the work that is happening on the grassroots and what is happening at the multilateral policy decision-making spaces. So most of the people who are actually driving the change within the grassroots movement have no idea, for instance, what is happening within the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework. They do not understand the 4 goals, the 23 targets, the National Biodiversity Action Plans and Strategies, the NBSAPs, and this makes them work at a very siloed way. And yet, if you look at the work that they're doing and look at, for instance, the targets that are available, look at target 8, target 11, 14, 15, 18, 19, and even 21, they would play a very significant role in helping move these targets forward. But I think we have not done very well in terms of aligning some of this grassroots work that is happening with national and international biodiversity policies and targets. I think within my duty of tour of duty, I have not seen one instance where we have leveraged the collective innovativeness of grassroots movement communities to ensure power is distributed in such a manner that everyone within the areas that they exist in are able to influence either directly or indirectly policy and decision making, and also actions that help speak to their own needs, but also helping expedite realization of these biodiversity and climate goals, again looking at the whole of government, whole of society approach, incorporating aspects like the ecosystem-based approaches, human rights-based approaches. I think that still lacks, but we can do that by supporting knowledge exchanges, again, between government and civil society movements, grassroots organizations, so that we don't seem like we are capacity building grassroots communities on what they are supposed to do, but sort of learning from them as we learn from the government and research, and ensuring that we move as a team. And finally, I think the one other way that they can do that is by developing collective manifestos that they want to push to governments, and also hold government to account. There are things like green manifestos. How do you ensure that the political class and the decision makers abide to the promises that they give to the people at the grassroots? I think I would want to leave it there at now and welcome questions, and maybe I might come back on the question of financing as we move along. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that contribution. And certainly in the various COPs that I've been to, some of the most exciting spaces and innovative ideas are held by youth spaces. And so I think collectively, there's a lot of work to do to leverage any positions that we have to support younger people that are pushing for change. I wondered if I could ask Eduardo a similar question based on your experience working with grassroots organizations, to maybe also reflect on the role that they can play in driving progress towards these biodiversity and restoration targets.
Bueno, buen día a todos, buen día, buenas tardes a todos. Es un placer estar hoy aquí compartiendo con ustedes este panel. Bueno, nosotros desde Fundación Avina creemos que los movimientos de base juegan un papel crucial en el avance hacia el objetivo de biodiversidad. Hace unos pocos días estaba leyendo una información de que aproximadamente un 22% del territorio latinoamericano está bajo alguna figura de protección, pero de esto solamente un poco más del 6% de estas áreas cuentan con una gobernanza que involucra a los grupos indígenas o las comunidades de base y campesinos. Entonces, esto evidencia un alto déficit en la participación comunitaria para la toma de decisiones en áreas protegidas en una región que es tan diversa y tan multicultural, ¿no? Entonces, ante esta situación, nosotros nos parece clave que se pueda avanzar hacia una conservación inclusiva, con un enfoque que reconozca y que valore el papel central de la construcción colectiva de base en la gestión de los ecosistemas. Creemos que los objetivos en materia de conservación y restauración solo van a ser alcanzados si se adopta un enfoque que sea más inclusivo, más efectivo y sobre todo basado en los derechos humanos. Y si bien existe un mayor reconocimiento de la necesidad de involucrar a las comunidades locales en la toma de decisiones sobre conservación, necesitamos con urgencia pasar a acciones significativas y concretas, ¿verdad? Y estas pueden implicar desde fortalecer los esquemas de gobernanza para la toma de decisiones, para la gestión y toma de decisiones en áreas protegidas y conservadas, y apoyar las iniciativas de conservación de base comunitaria, reconociendo derechos y las contribuciones de los grupos locales, de las comunidades indígenas, de las mujeres, de los jóvenes, como se había mencionado, y garantizando también la autonomía y participación activa y equitativa de este sector de la población en los procesos de toma de decisiones, ¿verdad? Necesitamos movilizar recursos e invertir en conversación inclusiva, poniendo en marcha mecanismos que hagan efectiva la participación, el fortalecimiento comunitario, organizacional, que los recursos lleguen realmente al territorio y que estas organizaciones sean parte del proceso, ¿no? Y también garantizar la distribución justa y equitativa de los beneficios, asegurando que todos los esfuerzos de conservación generen elementos tangibles e intangibles de bienestar para las comunidades locales, ¿verdad? Incluyendo oportunidades económicas y sobre todo mejora en los medios de vida.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights. I wondered if I could ask a question for all of the panelists, and it's maybe if you could just share your short responses, but it's if you could share what specific events you might have planned for COP16 or might be specifically interested in, and maybe just to share some details of those. So maybe if I can begin with you, Mrinalini, on some of the events that you have planned this year.
Nadia, thank you so much. There are a few side events that we have planned around the CBD, but we have to kind of finalize where they're going to be because we're still awaiting confirmation. So there are some events which are going to be in the blue zone, and there are some events that are going to be in the green zone. So we have events around the indicators. So Women for Biodiversity has developed a draft indicator for the gender plan of action, for which we are looking for it to get adopted at the COP16. So we have information discussion around that during this COP. Then we will also have bringing in 6 of our restoration partners, community-led, women engaged community. So we will be sharing their experiences. So we have that, and I'm happy to share all those dates once they are confirmed. But an important one is we are organizing a one-day conference on gender and environment data. And that is tentatively scheduled for the 20th of October. So do let us know if any one of you are coming. We'll be happy to extend the invitation and happy to have anybody attend the conference. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And again, thanks for sharing all of those details in the chat. And please, just to all of our panelists as well, feel free to look at the Q&A and answer any questions that you might be able to, or others, please also share your knowledge as well. Maybe back to you, Eduardo, about some of the events that you either have planned or you're particularly interested in at the COP.
Sí. Igualmente nosotros también estamos organizando 3 sites events en el Green Zone. Aún están en el proceso de diseño y definición de los panelistas, ¿verdad? Pero básicamente son sobre bioeconomía, biodiversidad y sector privado y acceso a financiación. Las fechas no están todavía confirmados los 3, pero los que tenemos confirmados serían entre el 26 y 28 de octubre. Y también hemos aplicado a otros side events en el Blue Zone que no tenemos aún confirmación, pero a medida que tengamos mayor claridad y definiciones, esos serán compartidos a través de las redes sociales de Fundación Avina.
Thanks. Thank you very much. And I'm sure it's the same for everyone that has submitted side events. They're all anxiously refreshing their emails to find out when we can hear whether those sessions have been successful or not. Maybe over to you, Peter, on some of the events that you have your eye on or are planning or know of within the youth networks.
Yeah, thank you, Nadia. I think because I am particularly biased towards, are you able to hear me?
We hear you well.
Awesome. I think because I'm particularly biased towards biodiversity and climate financing, I am particularly focusing on questions to do with financing and biodiversity. And so there will be the trade day on 26th of October. We'll be looking at potential pathways, best practices and solutions for trade and trade-related policies to address biodiversity laws and implement the goals and the targets of the biodiversity plan. That will be happening on the 26th of October. So it's a whole day of conversation around this particular trade and policies. And then on the 27th and 28th of October, there will be the Finance and Biodiversity Day, again, looking at financial flows within the biodiversity space, understanding obviously that biodiversity is significantly underfunded, but also if you look specifically at now the different quarters within biodiversity, grassroots movement, youth, women, the gender inequality issues, it becomes even more. So we want to see how are biodiversity financial flows happening within these spaces, and how do we ensure that we unlock biodiversity finance within the global multilateral processes, and ensure that they are directed to the grassroots where they are needed the most to do the work that is required to push the agenda forward. There is also the 7th GLF Investment Forum that will be happening on the 25th, which is also be key in terms of, I think it is in tandem with Goal 19 towards mobilizing 200 billion annually for biodiversity financing, and also seeing how this is distributed across the globe and the biodiversity sphere. And I cannot also finish without mentioning the upcoming multi-actor dialogue for the human rights-based approach workshop that started here in Nairobi sometime back in April, I think, went to Bonn, and then went to the UK, and finally it's culminating in Cali, Colombia. I think, Nadia, you have the specifics of the dates, but that is also a very important event to see how do we incorporate whole of government, whole of society, but also a rights-based approach to targeting, to dealing with the question of biodiversity, but also synergizing around the 3 Rio conventions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for sharing that. It certainly, just listening to everyone, it sounds like it will be an incredibly busy time. And maybe in the lead up to COP16, we can also try and share some of those resources on our social media. We can connect to your social media. So please, for those that are also listening in, if you have any events, please post them so we can also connect to those. We've still got some more time. There have been some questions that have been asked in the Q&A, but I wondered, there have been a couple of questions around the best way to engage if you haven't registered. Tristan has shared the registration link for those that can still and would like to register. But I wondered, there's still an opportunity for that space that Colombia is curating. It is unfortunately a little bit separate from the other space where the negotiations are happening. But there certainly sounds like, if you are in Colombia, lots of ways to engage. And some of the sessions, like the GLF investment case, offer hybrid opportunities to connect as well. I wondered, Tristan, if I could also just allow you a moment to also speak. If you're going to be extremely busy as the Secretariat in COP16, but are there any events that you know of that you think folks could connect to if they are in Cali this year, where civil society can engage?
Yeah, thanks, Nadia. So there are a couple of things. In terms of the negotiations themselves, there's no possibility to engage virtually. All engagement in the negotiations themselves has to be by people in the room. And so registration is needed. But I should also mention that for observers, as they're known, so civil society and non-state actors, to actually engage in the negotiations, there are rules, and there's a sort of a hierarchy system. But just to say, you can't engage in the negotiations themselves, even talking to some of the parties, some of the governments and others, unless you're physically in the room. There were some attempts to do hybrid, and obviously during COVID, it was all virtual. Experiences were very mixed, not particularly positive. So the decision has been taken that everyone has to be in the room. It will be live streamed though through, I think it's the YouTube CBD Live YouTube channel. So at least you can follow some of the negotiations and perhaps see and understand some of the discussions that have happened. For the side events though, the pavilion events, things like that, it's up to the organizers themselves to arrange for live streaming or even hybrid participation in those. So for the organizers themselves, please please mention if you are sharing. You will be providing a link for those to participate virtually. But that is certainly one way to potentially engage. I have shared the link, the details of the registration, the link for that in the Q&A. Somebody was asking about online registration. There are various requirements for registration, including that the organization itself needs to be accredited. So please look at that very carefully. Unfortunately, the deadline for new accreditations is already passed, but deadline for registration for those who would be able to go with an accredited agency is the 15th of September. And there's no sort of global funding available to support individuals. That's something for yourselves to have to, or at least we as a Secretariat are not able to support that. So another thing maybe to consider. In terms of specific events to follow, we are organizing a side event that will be specifically looking at biodiversity and climate change under the convention and where things have come from and where they're going. So just in terms of side events, I can't promise when everyone will be notified, but it should be in the next couple of weeks. Yes, I don't hold me to any particular date, but it should be fairly soon. And there also, for those who are accredited and can have access to the Blue Zone, the GBF Pavilion will have a number. Each day will have a specific theme. And there should be some very interesting discussions happening there and opportunities to engage in those discussions. So keep an eye out for that, as well as the Columbia Pavilion. I think they are organizing quite an interesting agenda over the course of the 2 weeks. In terms of civil society engagement, though, in general, I think what's happening in the green zone, this is expected to be pretty much the biggest green zone, as far as I know, for any CBD COP. The challenge, unfortunately, is that it is physically further away from the Blue Zone. It would be nice if they were at least just next door, but that's not the case. So even if you don't have registration for the Blue Zone itself, there should be quite a number of good opportunities to engage in the various discussions in Cali itself if you're able to be there. And again, I'm assuming that there will be a number of events that will be either live streamed or available for hybrid participation. So please keep an eye out for links for those. Was there anything else? Oh yeah, there was somebody who was asking about budget shortfalls. Yes, unfortunately, also in the biodiversity world, we're seeing funding being cut back, and that's a much bigger discussion because the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, the main funding body for the CBD, has had its biggest ever replenishment cycle. But even still, relative to what is needed, it is far short of where things should be. So yes, unfortunately, what's being reflected, what's happening under UNFCCC is also happening under CBD. Thanks.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Tristan. There was an interesting question that was asked in the chat, which was around some of the groups, around gender or youth, and whether they engage across the different conventions. And I wondered if there is someone on the panel. I did see, Mrinalini, that you were already typing a response, but I wondered if you or Peter or Eduardo wanted to share just some perspectives of how these types of conversations can happen across the different conventions.
Nadia, thank you. Yeah, I wrote in a rush. Yes, so just to also share that there are different but same threads that kind of are pulled in. So I'm just going to kind of give experience on the indigenous peoples and women. So that is part of what Win for Biodiversity, and along with quite a few of the organizations, do, is to kind of build the synergies and taking the message from one to the other. So I shared the example already, and I'm also part of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus. So they're named differently, but there is this cross sharing of information. So for The biodiversity, the Indigenous Caucus is referred to as the IIFB, International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. For the climate, you have the IIPCC, International Indigenous Platform for Indigenous Peoples for Climate Change. And for the SDGs, you have the Indigenous Peoples Major Group. So if you are either of one of these caucuses within the other spaces and want to engage with the CBD, you can also reach out to those constituencies if you're already part of, also with the civil society. For the gender and women, there are much more bigger organized caucuses in the climate, which is the women and gender constituency, a very strong and leading quite a lot in the climate negotiations. So what we work on of sharing information is sometimes we have like general webinars to share and update each other. And we work as feminist allies. So we do have that, but also understanding that that there is a principle of engagement of which process you're engaging. So say, for example, and that's what I said, it's really very important to look at those platforms that are existing, because to be honest, I will share that I see a lot of influx from the climate change with an interest to engage in the CBD, but also understanding that there is the space, and we just also have to see what the focus of our discussions are and how we engage, and also respecting the spaces that exist and see how best we could work around. Of course, we cannot agree on every single positioning. So that would be really very important. So if you are Indigenous peoples, parties do look for the IIFB's inputs into the discussions, right? So if you are from that constituency, then really happy to engage, and they can share the updates. So just quickly sharing, and hopefully that's helpful. So like when I go to the climate, I am a women and gender constituency member. When I'm in the CBD, I wear the hat of the Women's Caucus. When I go to the UNEP, I am the Women's Major Group. So just to understand that there are these platforms, and we can definitely use them, and they are open for anybody interested to join.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Really interesting to find out how you can engage across those different platforms. I wonder, is there another panelist that would like to answer this question?
Yeah, maybe I could go. So I would like to look at it from the youth perspective. I think just like she has said, Raya said that for the youth, we have Yango for UNFCCC, but also GBIN, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network for the Biodiversity COP. And for GBIN, for instance, they have just concluded the International Youth Biodiversity Forum, I think, in Japan, some serious conversations around biodiversity. So maybe my suggestion would be to look up for GBIN if you want to learn more about things to do with youth involvement in biodiversity, and subscribe to and join Yango if you want to participate in most climate matters and take part, contribute to negotiations and position building. But most importantly, I think within the grassroots, what we are doing, we're also trying to create some synergy around the different COPs. So for instance, I happen to be part of the team that is organizing this year's Kenya's Local Conference of Youth, and just the week ago, we have just concluded the pre-ELCOI workshop on nature-based solutions. And what we did, it is leading up to the COP, obviously the Conference of Party for UNFCCC, but we really took time to dig into CBD and understand the different goals, targets, indicators, but also the place of nature-based solutions in supporting both the UNFCCC targets and also the biodiversity targets as it is. So I think also within our own spaces, we are trying to do that. And just wanting again to thank the partners, VCA, SSN, WWF Kenya, for really trying to hold our hands in terms of the ideas that we're bringing on board, and just ensuring that we are able to execute this, and that information is really spread across spectrum, so that whether you're working in biodiversity or you're working in climate, we are able to synergize and co-create solutions that can provide co-benefits for both diversity issues and also climate issues.
Thank you so much for those final words. I know we are out of time, but I did want to just see, Eduardo, if you wanted to say anything just in closing, just to make sure everyone has a moment to speak.
Sí, con relación sobre todo a la participación de las comunidades de base en los espacios de negociación, ¿verdad? Ahí tenemos varias lecciones aprendidas que a la vez siguen siendo desafíos, ¿verdad? Cómo lograr una participación efectiva de las comunidades de base en los espacios de decisión, ¿verdad? Y nada, pasa por fomentar un poco la inclusión, incluir una amplia gama de actores, desde ONGs hasta comunidades locales, que nos asegure que lleven una diversidad de perspectivas y necesidades y planteamientos. La necesidad de una capacitación y empoderamiento, era capacitar a los representantes de la sociedad civil que comprendan los procesos de negociación y puedan participar de manera efectiva es fundamental, ¿verdad? El empoderamiento de estos actores permiten contribuir de manera significativa y defender mejor los intereses de comunidades. Incluso pasa por apoyarles desde los mismos procesos de acreditación a las convenciones para que puedan facilitar su participación. Promover alianzas estratégicas, incluirles en alianzas estratégicas para que puedan aumentar su influencia, su capacidad de acción. Y también facilitarles el acceso a recursos, ¿verdad? Uno de los mayores desafíos de las organizaciones civiles, los movimientos de base, es tener acceso a los recursos adecuados que les permitan incluso hasta participar de manera efectiva en las negociaciones, ¿verdad? Y tener también claridad sobre los diferentes espacios de incidencia local, ¿verdad? Además de la incidencia y participación en los espacios de negociación global, yo creo que las comunidades de base pueden tener un rol o deben tener un rol importante en la participación en los espacios locales de toma de decisiones. De manera que se pueda incidir primeramente a nivel de los gobiernos locales y que estos gobiernos locales lleven posturas que ya incluyan las necesidades y las miradas de las comunidades de base en los espacios globales de negociación.
Thank you so much. And just thank you again to all of our panelists and especially to all of the people participating in this webinar online as well. And apologies for not being able to answer all of your questions. I did see a hand was raised as well, but we are unfortunately out of time. I wonder, yeah, we will definitely share the recordings in each of the different languages that were supported today. We'll also, everyone that has registered, we have your contact details so can send them more information, and we'll collate all of the stuff that was shared in the chat and send that to you in a post-event mailer. We'll also send out a short survey where we'll collect some more ideas. So please look out for that in your inboxes. We also can share on the slide here, we've got some of our social media handles where we'll be sharing some more information, especially linked to the recordings from both of the projects that we're convening and co-convening this webinar. But just to say, this was just a snapshot and just an initial way to start having these discussions. You've heard from some of the speakers, and it would be lovely to start or at least continue having these discussions and build some momentum ahead of COP16 and ahead of all of the other COPs as well. Because what we've heard from lots of the speakers is that biodiversity and climate are completely interconnected and reinforce each other. And so we really do need coordinated efforts right from grassroots all the way up to these global negotiation spaces. So on behalf of all the team, and thank you to all the technical support that's also been happening, and we can continue to have these discussions online. Please share some of the information and events that you'll be participating in so we can also engage in those spaces. So just to say thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see lots of you again soon in other spaces.